February 1943, North Atlantic, 600 miles southeast of Iceland. Gray pre-dawn, heavy swell, diesel fumes in the conning tower. Through a damp periscope, Kapitan Lieutenant Heinrich Bleichrodt watches his eel run true. The torpedo strikes the Liberty ship SS John Randolph amidships. Flash, column of spray, a metallic thump that should finish her. He waits for the sequence: fire, list, break, slide. It doesn't come. The ship lurches but refuses the script. She slows, smoke trailing, yet her 441-foot hull does not unzip. Plates bulge. Seams hold. The bow lifts through black water with stubborn grace. Bleichrodt logs the hit, notes unusual resistance, and turns for a second pass. Surprised, the sea has not taken the prize. He cannot see the change under the paint, joints fused by weld, not rows of rivets. Heat lines that act like lock stitches under strain, a pattern taught to yard crews by a civilian whose trick redirected fracture away from a fatal run. Built in weeks by men and women on 12-hour shifts, these cargo workhorses, 10,000 tons dead weight, 11-knot convoy speed, are learning to survive the Atlantic. The Randolph limps east as escorts converge, her wound ugly but contained, and the U-boat slides under the swell, denied. To understand why steel bent without breaking, we must leave the gale and return to the yards. Back to the welder who changed how a ship holds together. Forever altered. January 1942. The Atlantic was a graveyard. Beneath the black water, Admiral Dönitz's U-boats moved like wolves in a pack, sleek, silent, and deadly. Convoys burned night after night, the horizon lit with the orange glow of dying ships. Britain's lifeline was snapping. 1 million tons of merchant shipping went down every month. For the island nation, that meant empty shelves, rationed coal, and the creeping fear of hunger. The war in Europe was balanced not on battlefields, but on shipping manifests and tonnage delivered across an unforgiving sea. When the United States entered the war, the arithmetic of survival changed. Washington realized it could not win with destroyers alone. It needed cargo ships, thousands of them, to haul everything from tanks to tinned beef. The U.S. Maritime Commission and industrialist Henry J. Kaiser began what many believed impossible: building an entire navy of merchants faster than the enemy could sink them. They called them Liberty ships, simple, rugged freighters of 10,000 tons, designed to carry the lifeblood of war to Britain, the Soviet Union, and the Pacific. The first ones were crude and slow, 11 knots at best, but what they lacked in elegance, they made up for in numbers. In 1942 alone, shipyards from Maine to California roared to life, welding hulls day and night under clouds of sparks. By the war's end, 2,010 Liberty ships had been launched, each stamped from standardized blueprints, assembled in modular pieces, and pushed into the sea sometimes less than 45 days after the keel was laid. But this furious pace came with a cost. Riveted joints, the old standard of shipbuilding, could not withstand the shock of explosions or the brutal contraction of steel in subarctic waters. Some hulls cracked without warning, splitting clean from bow to stern. Engineers were alarmed. The war demanded speed, but speed was tearing ships apart. America needed something stronger, something faster to build, and far more forgiving under stress. In the months ahead, one civilian's unlikely welding breakthrough would give the Liberty ships a second life. And the Atlantic, its first real hope of turning the tide. Spring 1942. The clang of hammers still echoed through American shipyards, an old rhythm from another age. For generations, shipbuilding had been the domain of riveters. Teams of men working in pairs, one holding a red-hot bolt with tongs, the other hammering it home with a pneumatic gun. Each Liberty ship required more than 600,000 rivets, each one driven by hand and sealed with sweat. It was precise, grueling, and slow. Even with record crews, a single hull could take months. The war, however, did not allow months. That urgency brought in a new technique, one that seemed almost heretical to traditional builders. Welding. Instead of fastening steel with bolts, welding fused plates directly using an electric arc hotter than the surface of the sun. The result was a continuous joint, faster to produce and lighter to float. Henry Kaiser championed it as the key to his production miracle. A riveted hull might take 230 days to complete. A welded one could be done in 45. Yet for all its promise, welding carried a dangerous unknown. The metal cooled unevenly, sometimes turning brittle under the sub-zero stress of the North Atlantic. Small cracks became catastrophic splits. At the Bethlehem Fairfield shipyard in Maryland, one foreman refused to accept the failures as fate. Charles Dutch Pfeiffer, a stocky welder from Ohio with grease-stained overalls and an engineer's curiosity, began experimenting after hours. He noticed that continuous weld seams tended to fracture cleanly when stressed, almost like tearing cloth. His idea was radical: introduce microscopic breaks, skip gaps, in long seams, allowing steel to flex under pressure rather than snap. When tested late in 1942 under explosive charge simulations, Pfeiffer's welds flexed, groaned, but held. The plates warped. They did not rupture. Word spread quietly through the shipyards. No official bulletin, just welders teaching welders. In weeks, the practice became standard, transforming shipbuilding from an ancient craft into a modern science of controlled stress and industrial precision. What began as one man's intuition would soon ripple across every yard, producing Liberty ships. Ships now stronger, lighter, and ready to face the Atlantic's hammering. March 1943. The North Atlantic roared like a living thing. Sleet, ice, and gray water thrashing against blackened hulls. Convoy HX-230 pushed east toward Britain, its merchantmen strung out in the cold like tired soldiers. Among them was the SS Benjamin Harrison, a Liberty ship fresh from the yards at Baltimore, her seams still silver from new welds. She carried food, fuel, and ammunition, 10,000 tons of war's lifeblood, bound for a Britain still starving under siege. Beneath her, silent and waiting, a German Type 7C U-boat adjusted depth and bearing. At 0147 hours, Captain Lieutenant Eric Topp fired one G7E electric torpedo. The weapon hit dead center, below the waterline between holds number 3 and 4. The blast ripped open a 20-foot gash, water roaring in with the sound of tearing steel. Lights flickered. Bulkheads groaned. Captain Harold D. Whitaker, believing she was lost, gave the order to prepare lifeboats. But the Benjamin Harrison refused to die. Her list stabilized at 8 degrees and held. The second officer, flashlight in hand, crawled down into the flooded compartment and found something that defied reason. The fracture had traveled exactly to a welded joint and stopped. The seam flexed inward, warped but intact, acting like a hinge instead of a fault line. With pumps running and the storm easing, the Harrison began limping north, her engines coughing but alive. 2 days later, she reached Reykjavik, aided by a British trawler that towed her the final miles. Naval engineers swarmed her hull, sketching, measuring, and finally concluding that Pfeiffer's skip-gap pattern had absorbed the blast. Their report to the U.S. Maritime Commission read, "Weld flexion contained rupture, buoyancy maintained." Across the Atlantic, German intelligence intercepted snippets of the message and drew a wild conclusion: American hulls coated with elastic material. For U-boat commanders, once confident that a single torpedo could sink any freighter, doubt crept in. The Liberty ship had taken the blow and lived. For the first time, the Battle of the Atlantic tilted not toward the predator, but the prey that refused to drown. Berlin, April 1943. Inside the headquarters of the Kriegsmarine, reports from the Atlantic arrived with an unsettling pattern. 7 Liberty ships, all struck by confirmed torpedoes, had either remained afloat for hours or survived altogether. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, studied the dispatches in disbelief. These were supposed to be disposable freighters, mass-produced, clumsy, thin-skinned. Yet captains returning from patrol wrote of liberties that burn but do not drown. It was a quiet crisis for the vaunted wolf packs, one that no tactical chart could explain. Technical officers scoured intercepted Allied broadcasts and repair logs. One report noted abnormal flotation in welded cargo class. Another, from U-402, described how a Liberty hit aft continued steaming in circles. its decks aflame before rescue destroyers drove the submarine off. Dönitz's staff suspected secret metallurgy. Rumors spread through the U-boat pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. The Americans had discovered elastic steel, or perhaps coated their hulls in a rubber-like layer. Crews began nicknaming the ship's dye Unsinkbaren, the Unsinkables. The Naval Intelligence Office, B-Dienst, attempted a scientific explanation. Divers recovered steel fragments from wrecks off Norway, sending them to Berlin for analysis. Laboratory results only deepened the confusion. The grain structure of the metal showed unusual heat distortion, leading chemists to conclude that molecular reconfiguration under extreme heat treatment was responsible for the ship's resilience. In reality, the heat signatures came from welding, not alloy transformation. But within the closed corridors of German command, misunderstanding became dogma. Dönitz ordered adjustments to torpedo depth and detonation angle, hoping to strike below the mysterious flex zone. It achieved nothing. The Liberty ships kept floating, while Allied aircraft and sonar made the Atlantic deadlier for submarines by the week. By mid-1943, the hunters were the hunted, and what the Germans mistook for alchemy was, in truth, a welder's simple trick multiplied across an empire of steel and sparks. Summer 1943, Richmond, California. The air shimmered with heat and the metallic scent of ozone. Sparks rained from hundreds of arcs as welders, men in soot-black helmets and women in denim overalls, worked shoulder to shoulder along the hull of another Liberty ship. Henry J. Kaiser's vast Richmond shipyards had become a marvel of industrial rhythm, where shipbuilding followed the cadence of an assembly line. Steel plates, pre-cut and numbered, slid into place as cranes swung overhead. The clang of rivet guns was gone, replaced by the hiss and roar of electric arcs fusing metal to metal. What had once taken months now took mere weeks. The miracle reached its zenith in November 1942, when the SS Robert E. Peary stunned the world, built, assembled, launched, and ready for sea trials in just 4 days. 15 hours and 29 minutes. Crowds cheered from the docks, but the true victory was invisible. The ship's hull was held together by flexible weld seams modeled after Pfeiffer's design. Each seam allowed minute expansion and contraction as the ship met the cold shock of the Atlantic, preventing catastrophic cracking. By mid-1943, this innovation became doctrine. Shipyards in Portland, Baltimore, and Brunswick were ordered to adopt the modified weld layout across hull sections 19 through 37, the most frequent impact zones from torpedoes. Inspectors from the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships noted the result with bureaucratic precision. Fracture rate reduced by 72% over riveted baseline. Repairs grew simpler. Turnaround times shortened. Every Liberty ship completed was a blow against Dönitz's campaign. America wasn't just replacing losses, it was outbuilding the enemy faster than they could sink them. Welding had turned into a kind of maritime alchemy, the transformation of sparks into strength, speed, and survival. Across the oceans, convoys thickened with ships that refused to die. July 1943, the Mediterranean burned under the glare of a Sicilian summer. Over 300 Liberty ships, gray and utilitarian, advanced toward the island like a moving city. Their decks groaned under tanks, trucks, and crates of ammunition, each vessel carrying the muscle of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. Luftwaffe bombers prowled above, dropping through the haze to release strings of bombs that churned the sea white. Yet time and again, the Liberties endured. One, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, took strafing fire along her bridge and near misses close enough to rock the hull, but she never faltered. Her welded seams flexed with the concussions that would have cracked older ships in two. To the men watching from destroyer escorts, it seemed almost unnatural, these merchantmen taking punishment like warships. By 1944, the Liberty fleet had become the lifeline of every Allied offensive. In June, as dawn broke over Normandy, their silhouettes crowded the horizon. Operation Overlord, the greatest amphibious invasion in history, was built upon their steel backs. Thousands of tons of jeeps, rations, munitions, and gasoline poured ashore, much of it unloaded directly from Liberties anchored off the beaches. Their hulls, repeatedly grounding against shifting sandbars, absorbed constant shock without splitting, a direct triumph of Pfeiffer's flexible welds. Naval engineers studying post-operation reports found a striking statistic. Older riveted cargo ships showed frame distortions twice as often under identical conditions. The Liberty design, once doubted and derided, had become the very symbol of endurance. Each ship was proof that speed and strength could coexist. Proof that improvisation, not perfection, had turned the tide of logistics. In the clash between precision and adaptability, German engineering met its quiet rival, the intuitive genius of an American welder. The Liberty fleet, born of necessity, had carried freedom itself across the world's most dangerous seas. By early 1944, the Liberty ship was no longer just a freighter. It was a legend afloat. Across the docks of Liverpool and Boston, their gray hulls symbolized something larger than steel or cargo. German U-boat captains, once the terrors of the Atlantic, now muttered with weary respect, "The Americans build ships faster than we can sink them." What had begun as a desperate improvisation in American shipyards had become a quiet form of psychological warfare. Every Liberty that rose from the yards was not only a replacement for one lost, it was proof that the Allies could not be strangled. Among Allied crews, fear gave way to faith. The Black Pit, once the haunted mid-Atlantic void where convoys vanished, now felt survivable. Letters from merchant marine officers spoke of ships that feel alive, bending, but never breaking. Welders back home, listening to the news in cafeteria break rooms, realized their torchwork was saving lives an ocean away. To them, every bead of molten metal meant another chance for a ship to come home. German morale, in contrast, began to sink faster than their tonnage reports. Between January and June 1944, U-boat sinkings soared while Liberty ship survival rates climbed. Allied propaganda seized the moment. Newsreels flashed sparks across factory floors. Slogans blazed across posters. "She was born in a day, and Liberty ships don't die." The image of the welder's arc, once a symbol of labor, had become a symbol of invincibility. Behind the myth stood a truth more human than heroic, a welder's intuition, a skipped seam, a flexible joint. Pfeiffer's humble discovery had become metaphor, a working man's defiance cast in steel. Each Liberty that shrugged off a torpedo carried not just supplies, but conviction. In the war of machines and men, it was morale, not metallurgy, that changed the tide. Winter, 1944. The war's tide had turned, but the Atlantic remained merciless. Along the American and Canadian coasts, Liberty ships rode at anchor in freezing harbors, their decks coated with ice, their steel hulls groaning under the weight of cold. Then, without warning, disaster struck, not from torpedoes or bombs, but from within. On a frigid January night in Portland, Oregon, the SS Schenectady, brand new and idle at the dock, split in half with a deafening crack. No explosion, no collision, just the sound of steel tearing itself apart. The stern rose from the water like a hinge, engines still humming as the ship broke clean along her welded seams. The sight horrified engineers and seamen alike. Within weeks, similar reports came from the Great Lakes, Halifax, and Murmansk convoys. Ships that had survived the Atlantic's violence were fracturing in calm waters. Investigators from the U.S. Navy and the National Bureau of Standards raced to uncover the cause. Their findings were sobering. The culprit was not poor welding, but physics itself, brittle fracture, a phenomenon where steel, chilled below a certain temperature, lost its ductility and snapped like glass. The rapid mass production of wartime steel had introduced microscopic impurities, and under Arctic cold, those flaws became fatal. Charles Dutch Pfeiffer's flexible weld technique had prevented many such ruptures by redirecting stress, but even his ingenuity couldn't counter the molecular brittleness of flawed plate metal. Engineers responded swiftly, redesigning joint patterns, drilling crack-arrest holes to stop fractures from spreading, and introducing preheating protocols before welding in cold zones. By early 1945, the crisis was largely contained, the lessons etched in every revised blueprint. Yet the episode served as a humbling reminder. Even triumphs born of necessity demanded constant evolution. In both war and engineering, victory was never permanent. It had to be maintained, one weld at a time. By 1945, the war that had begun with chaos and improvisation was ending with precision and mastery. The Liberty ship, once dismissed as a crude, temporary freighter, had matured into a symbol of disciplined innovation. In the great shipyards of Brunswick, Georgia, and New Orleans, the final generation of Liberties took shape under brighter conditions, but no less urgency. Their hulls bore subtle differences invisible to the untrained eye, staggered weld seams that distributed stress diagonally rather than in straight lines, new manganese steel alloys less prone to brittle fracture, and reinforced bulkheads that absorbed underwater shock like cushions of steel. The lessons of the Schenectady disaster and of Pfeiffer's flexible welds had been merged into one unified philosophy: engineering that bent so it would not break. At the Brunswick Yard, inspectors from the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships began referring to this approach as the controlled flex weld, a standard that blended Pfeiffer's field wisdom with metallurgical science. The process was codified, tested, and stamped into every new hull section. Shipwrights, many of them women who had spent the war wielding torches, now worked from refined blueprints that reflected 4 years of learning bought by fire and blood. In September 1945, as peace flickered on the horizon, the SS Albert M. Bow rolled down the ways at Portland, the last Liberty ship of the war. Her design embodied everything the program had learned: resilience through adaptation. She would later survive collisions, ice, and storms, proof that the Liberty fleet's evolution had reached its peak. After the war, captured German naval archives revealed what Allied welders had never known. One U-boat officer's logbook recorded, almost grudgingly, "American cargo hulls now exhibit near-elastic recovery after hit." The Liberty ship's final legacy was not just steel, it was the enduring truth that necessity refines genius, and that even in total war, progress is forged by human hands. When peace finally settled over the seas in 1945, the Liberty ships, those gray workhorses of war, faced a new mission. Many bore scars from torpedoes and storms, yet hundreds still floated sound and serviceable. Instead of being retired, they became the backbone of post-war reconstruction. The same hulls that once carried tanks and munitions now hauled coal, wheat, and machinery to rebuild shattered cities from Marseille to Manila. In the years that followed, Liberty ships could be seen in every major port, patched, repainted, renamed, but unmistakable in silhouette. Their influence spread far beyond their own decks. The success of welded construction transformed global shipbuilding. Riveting, once the shipwright's pride, faded into obsolescence. Pfeiffer's principle of flexible welding, formalized after the war as part of the American Bureau of Shipping's standards, became the foundation for peacetime design. The concept, allowing steel to yield without failing, was adopted for tankers, freighters, and even aircraft carriers. The International Maritime Organization, formed in 1948, incorporated those lessons into its first structural safety recommendations. Across the world, nations rebuilt their maritime industries using what had begun as an American experiment born of urgency. In Japan and Germany, defeated but determined to recover, engineers pored over captured U.S. reports, tracing the logic of Liberty ship welding. They studied Pfeiffer's controlled flex patterns, incorporating them into their own new fleets. Meanwhile, many of the original Liberties continued to serve quietly for decades, converted into grain carriers, hospital ships, and refugee transports. Some even sailed into the 1960s, rusted but reliable, still proving the durability of wartime craftsmanship. Historians later called the Liberty ship the most forgiving machine ever built. It was never flawless, never graceful, but it endured. Its true genius lay not in perfection, but in resilience. From one welder's spark, a new era of shipbuilding had been forged, an enduring flame lighting the course of maritime progress. February 1943, North Atlantic. Through the narrow circle of his periscope, Kapitän Leutnant Heinrich Bleichrodt watched a torpedo strike home and fail to kill. In that frozen moment, the commander of U-boat fame glimpsed something he could not understand, a freighter that would not die. The SS John Randolph did not know it, but her survival marked the twilight of the submarine's reign. What Bleichrodt mistook for luck was, in truth, the quiet victory of human ingenuity, the fusion of observation, necessity, and steel. The Liberty ship had been born not from military genius, but from civilian hands, welders, foremen, and engineers who saw the problem, studied the cracks, and refused to accept them as fate. Among them, Charles Dutch Pfeiffer, unknown to history's grand stage, had altered the very logic of shipbuilding. His flexible welds, once dismissed as shortcuts, had become the unseen armor of an entire fleet. By the war's end, U-boats lay rusting on the seabed, while Liberty ships sailed on, patched, creaking, but alive. They were not unsinkable by magic or myth. They endured because intellect had met will at precisely the right moment in time. The torch of the welder had, quite literally, outshone the periscope. From the depths, the hunter's gaze dimmed. From the shipyards, the sparks rose higher. And in that meeting of light and shadow, the war at sea changed forever, proof that sometimes the smallest human spark can turn the tide of the world.